So no.
All set?
We're all set.
Let's do it. Everybody, it has been...
Wait, what's going on here?
I'm fixing it because they're driving me nuts.
Oh,
All right,
okay.
cool.
I think the fun thing about this band is you probably already have the vibe of the thing understood at this point. Okay, we're going to do something. It's going to be stupid. We're all going to have fun. The content is for real, but the form is not. So thank you very much for being a part of this. We are MCtheProfessor.GOV, and we're going to do a thing for you.
That's what we do.
I'm not going to make an argument that will come as a surprise to any of you. Because this isn't really about making a claim or a counterclaim. It is more about trying to explore and clarify the context in which we make claims and counterclaims. But everything is structured around this. When the Honorable Mayor Thomas P. Koch of the city of Quincy in September of 2023, in the context of a few dozen Haitian families staying temporarily on the campus of Eastern Nazarene College, has the gall to use the phrase, "We can't have open borders," it requires a response. My response is this. The United States does not have open borders. Despite the frequent use of the term, it is true that a great number of asylum seekers arrive daily at the US-Mexico border intent on entering the United States, but it strains credulity to frame this as a problem of open borders. Here's why. Okay, let's get the basics down here. As you can see, rendering questions of immigration, asylum seeking, and human mobility in the terms of the border is a political choice. I'll say it again, it is a political choice, and it is one which shapes public policy common sense. In other words, if you choose to frame the question of human mobility as a problem of the border, there is a logic that's baked into that language. The logic is obvious. If the problem is the border, the framing is, it's open, so you close it. And this is one of the reasons why uncritically and unproblematically adopting this kind of language, and even using a phrase like border crisis, contributes to obfuscating the issues it is supposed to address. And indeed assuming the shape of those issues. The open borders myth relies on the conflation of two things that are quite different. On the one hand, the fact that segments of the US-Mexico border exist without man-made barriers. That there are any segments of the US-Mexico border without man-made barriers, this is conflated with the functional absence of any immigration restrictions whatsoever. It's a very wild leap of logic. It is made every day. If I say that there are open borders, I might be pointing to the one and silently gesturing at the other. Now, one of these things is true, one of them is patently not. If we observe in our own politics the ways that the political logic of this conflation functions, we get the following things. This is where you get the idea of migration as invasion. It's where you get calls to shut down the border, i.e. to end immigration as a solution. Again, a solution to a problem, both of which are baked into the language. And immigration reform becomes the demand for a ludicrously expensive, endlessly expensive American Maginot Line. Foolishness. If we do not have open borders, then what do we have? If in fact we do not have open borders, then what do we have? 1. A sprawling physical infrastructure of militarized ports of entry, border patrol stations, public and private detention centers, and hundreds of miles of man-made barriers. This we do have. If we do not have open borders, what else do we have? Multiple, multi-billion-dollar federal law enforcement agencies. Immigration and Customs Enforcement, Customs and Border Protection, the latter of which includes the Border Patrol. You can't see the numbers, but this is, okay, if Customs and Border Protection is like the bigger thing, the Border Patrol is inside of that. That graph is the budget for the Border Patrol from 1990, the year I was born, until 2021, okay? You can sort of see what's happening. You'll also notice it is an unbroken escalation, right? Giving the lie to the idea that there is some kind of back and forth in immigration policy, which there's not. If we do not have open borders, what do we have? A Byzantine web of legal restrictions, which keep people either waiting in line for years in perpetual legal limbo or in a state of absolute precarity, depending on their circumstances. These three things we have. All of which are completely obscured by this narrative, this language, this political argument. So how should we make sense of this then? What is an alternative to the open borders framing that we can use? One is just to think in terms of human mobility as a general phenomenon. Even if we eliminate like immigration from the equation here, right? Because human migration does not all cross international borders, right? There's internal migration, there's immigration. The only difference is that whether or not you're crossing an international border, but it turns out that more or less the same things motivate these movements. It is also the case these movements are happening all the time, for more or less predictable reasons. You all know this. Push factors. Pressure people to leave a place. Poor economic conditions, war, natural disaster, etc. Pull factors draw people to a different place. Family, better job, safety, political stability, etc. Legal restrictions can impede these things, sure. But adding layers of difficulty and danger via immigration restriction measures, legal or otherwise, does not fundamentally alter this calculus of mobility. Adding layers of difficulty and danger via immigration restriction measures does not fundamentally alter this calculus of mobility. That means people are going to move anyway. You can put barriers in their way, but they're going to move anyway. This has always been true. And this is an important starting place for thinking about issues of human mobility. Human mobility is an inevitability because of these push and pull factors, which are, in a sense, cyclical. You can't stop it. And this is the context in which we should understand the history of immigration restriction. And just so that we understand the broad trends, you may have seen a graph like this before. I'm not going to go into why this is... It's fine. It's fine. Whatever. I'm not going to go into it. But you get the point. Number of immigrants, year, and it's by decade, so we're kind of losing a lot of the little little details, but you see the broad strokes. Is it true that an incredibly restrictive immigration law was passed in 1924? Oh, you better believe it. Are we going to talk about it? Yeah. But it'd be difficult to make the argument that the Great Depression happening right after that and World War II happening right after that, or during that, didn't have a very serious effect on migration. And in fact, if you want to actually understand these trends, it's important for you to look at a variety of different factors, including, prevailing economic, geopolitical conditions. We have some chairs in the back here if you want to, sneak in there. You do what you want. You make yourself comfortable. You lay, it doesn't matter. Lay down. Grab onto the ceiling. Okay. What are we talking about? So, takeaway. The open borders framing does not help us understand what is happening, nor does it offer meaningful guidance for future public policy. As a result, it should be discarded in a ditch and left alone. And that would be perfectly fine with me. In 2014, May Nye, pictured, historian May Nye, published a very important book called Impossible Subjects, in which she argued the following. Immigration restriction laws and policies, specifically from the period from 1924 to 1965, have created liminal immigration statuses, quote-unquote illegal aliens, alien citizens, colonial subjects, and foreign contract workers. Liminal because they are neither in nor out. They're somewhere in between, in different ways. She thus argues that undocumented people are, in a phrase of her own coinage, impossible subjects. Quote, persons whose presence is a social reality, yet a legal impossibility. A social reality, but a legal impossibility. Impossible subjects. And these impossible subjects have three pathways to some kind of resolution. Legalization, expulsion, or a hyper-exploitable state of legal limbo forever. Now, Nye's book is very important for a variety of reasons, but I'll give you two. One is she beckons us to think about immigration restriction law and the worlds that the law creates. The worlds that the law creates. The other is she gets us thinking about what we could call uneven integration. Again, those liminal statuses, the in-between, not quite in, not quite out. And more to the point, she gets us thinking about the ways that those liminal statuses are created as a matter of course, when the machine is working properly, not aberrations. Part of the design. This brings us to historicity. If the law has created these liminal legal statuses, if the law has created these impossible subjects, when did it happen? Were there ever open borders? How far back do we have to go? I'm not going to interrogate that question seriously, because the concept is silly. But I'm going to do a little bit. Let's talk about a history of immigration restriction. We all know where it starts. When at that same public meeting in September in Quincy, I referenced the Immigration Act of 1924, I was quoted by the local newspaper as having mentioned the Chinese Exclusion Act. When you watch the tape, I did not talk about that. Whatever. It's the law people know. So, the Page Act and after it, the Chinese Exclusion Act, late 19th century, are the first examples of modern immigration restriction laws, right? They're the first laws that say you're not allowed to enter the country. In a sense, they're unique too. Because they targeted a particular group of people. And more to the point, they targeted them through an ethnic and racial lens, not a national lens. In other words, if you were of Chinese ancestry, but you were like a third-generation Mexican, it didn't matter. You were Chinese. The Exclusion Act and all of its iterations as it was extended and expanded also was the first law or series of laws to require people to carry immigration papers. It was the law that helped to create the first real infrastructure for deportation. It was the first time that people were ever placed on the US-Mexico border to patrol it, was to stop the Chinese. Small numbers, but they were done. Restrictions on Europeans came later. Same year, with one little thing, very shortly after. Ban on those who were deemed criminals or deemed insane. 1891, a ban on those with contagious diseases like tuberculosis, those likely to become public charges, and polygamists. This was the impetus for the creation of Ellis Island, because if you are going to test people for diseases, you need somewhere to do it. It's an important reminder that immigration restriction, like all restrictive laws, require an enforcement infrastructure. In other words, they require an expansion of state capacity. Yes? You need new government powers, and that requires you to build out the institutions that do that. 1903, a ban on anarchists. I think they caught, if I remember this correctly, 38 people over the whole life of this. It was just, I think it was a questionnaire. like, do you think that the government should be violently overthrown? That was their, first of all, that was their interpretation of the anarchist movement. But second of all, you just go, no. I don't know who the 38 were, but that's pretty cool. 1907 saw the first requirement to enter through official ports of entry, which had then required, of course, the physical build-out of an infrastructure of ports of entry. In 1917, a literacy test was introduced. You'll notice I haven't talked about the gentleman's agreement. Fine, I'll talk about it. Right, so China is excluded in 1882, the Japanese self-excluded in 1907. In 1917, everyone in Asia except the Japanese and the Filipinos, the Japanese because they were a very powerful empire, the Filipinos because they were colonized, was banned. But so far there has been no ban on Europeans, nor has there, you'll notice, been a cap. No numerical cap. And then something changed. 1921, the Emergency Quota Act. A law many of you may never have heard of before. Very important. The Emergency Quota Act is actually the law that introduced national quotas for the first time. It said that, get your pens out, okay? European nations, 3% of the foreign-born population of that nationality in the United States as of the 1910 census was allowed to enter the country per annum. Okay? 3% of that nationality's foreign-born population in the US as of the 1910 census. So, however many foreign-born German people there are in 1910, take 3% of that, that number can enter every year. The total was somewhere around 350,000 people, which is quite a dramatic drop from around, call it something like 850,000 the year before, and that number was a bit of a drop from earlier because immigration, as you might be able to guess, had dropped during World War I. Obviously. But this law was always understood to be temporary. It was dealing with this post-World War I madness around immigration and also the first Red Scare. Oh my God, all the Italians are anarchists, all the Russians are Bolsheviks, they're gonna do mail bombs to my house and we're all gonna die, and I'm so scared, so they had to stop it, right? That was the idea. But it was gonna be replaced by something more permanent, and it was in 1924 with the Johnson-Reed Act, or the Immigration Act of 1924. The law that I actually referenced at that meeting in the middle of September in 2023. It's the Patriot Ledger is the news one. So what does that do? This basically made permanent and tightened those national quotas. You want to know the new formula? Ready? All right, new formula. 2% of that nationality's foreign and native-born population as of the 1890 census. Okay? Now, why? Why 1890? Any guesses? Audience guesses? Why 1890? Most of the Eastern and Southern Europeans started coming after 1890. So this is like the Italians and the Austro-Hungarians and the Russians, and of course, not all, but virtually all of the Jewish immigrants during that period were Russians, right? So all of the Eastern and Southern Europeans who were seen as particularly foreign compared to the Germans and the Irish and the British, right, had to be kept out, but they didn't, for whatever reason, want to have a law that just said, you can't come in if you're Italian, right? So instead they said, oh, we'll just do, 2% of that group's population before 1890, whatever. But the function was clear, and the result was astonishing. Italians and Russians were the largest groups, and they just collapsed. And who was it? Who then, in this new and even more restrictive environment, was still allowed to come in relatively large numbers? The Germans, Irish, and British. So this was a law intended to not only dramatically reduce overall immigration, which it did. By the time you get to 1925, we are talking about like an 80% cut from when World War I started, right? Immigration just collapses. It was also designed to change the racial and ethnic makeup of immigrants, right? Again, because this quota formula favors Northern and Western Europeans, Scandinavians, and we're also in there too. Scandinavians and Western Europeans. Southern and Eastern Europeans cut out, all Asians banned, and notably, the Japanese were included in this one. So the Japanese had been allied with the British for a period of time, and when that sort of soured, the Japanese-American tensions were worsening, and this was one of those boops in the nose during this period of inter-imperial conflict, where the U.S. said, no, even though the Japanese had essentially self-excluded, now you formally are not allowed in the country anymore. That was considered a great disrespectful act. Filipinos still permitted in as colonial subjects, but they're not citizens. They are American nationals. Citizenship was never extended. The Johnson-Reed Act has another interesting component. It was also the first law ever to require visas to cross from the Western Hemisphere. Before 1924, if you were from Mexico, There's no visa. There's none of that. You just go in there. It's basically like Ellis Island, right? No restrictions. After 1924, now you have to have a visa. And this is where, as you can imagine, a lot of problems started. This is, as it were, the birth of so-called illegal immigration. Before 1921, if you were a European, you couldn't be a quote-unquote illegal immigrant. It wasn't possible. I hate to go back to this meeting again, but I'll tell you. If you happen to be in the room right now and are also one of the people who shouted from the back of the middle and the front of the room in Central Middle School in Quincy in mid-September 2023 and said something to the effect of, "My family came here legally," I don't know about that. I don't know if it counts if there's no laws against you. That's kind of weird. I'm legally holding this microphone. Awesome, dude. Alright, you ready for this one? I'm proud of this one. I'm so excited for this. It's great. There's no point to having done it this way, but it's funny. Okay, take a look at it. I'm drawing here on a guy named MCtheProfessor.GOV, a very important historian who wrote a book called Barbarian Virtues in, I think, the year 2000, 2001, thereabouts. I'll read you the quote first. If racial notions of a superior Anglo-Saxon peoplehood justified policies of imperial conquest abroad, so did they generate considerable anxiety about the fate of a free republic that had taken on too many undesirable elements. Here's his argument. During the Gilded Age, industrialization triggers two related processes. One is the need for new markets and resources, on your right side. This need for new markets and resources, we're drawing on an old Walter Lefebvre argument, an old William Appleman Williams argument. Y'all remember that one, 1959? The revisionist school. If you need markets and resources, you have to do empire, right? I don't have a place to sell my stuff. I mean, I don't know if you, let's like actually take the longer context here. The late 19th century has all of these gigantic economic collapses, right? There's the, Panic of 1873, and then again 20 years later, these long-term depressions. And the idea built up in the 1870s, 80s, and 90s that if you could have an infinite market, you could avoid ever having an economic crash, right? There's always people to sell to. And the main thing was this idea of the China market, which was this sort of like quasi-mystical thing of, the China market just meant an unlimited market, right? And so there's all these fantasies about the China market. There's all this building of a Pacific Empire, building of all of these naval bases, building of the Great White Fleet, right? The construction of this gigantic infrastructure of naval power around the world in order to facilitate access to the China market, but more generally, to access colonies that you could dump your surplus goods onto in order to avoid economic recessions and depressions at home. That's the idea, right? On the other hand, that same industrialization creates a labor shortage, right? A need for labor in America's urban centers. And that draws a lot of people into the country, which is then the prehistory of immigration restriction. And all of this has an ideological knock-on effect, something we can call racial border making. There's a great irony to the racist politics of this time. Because when the Americans go to the Philippines and kill 200,000 people to conquer that land, they can do it by saying, these people are savages who have to be civilized, and the light of American civilization, when it touches their benighted souls, will raise them to our level of civilization. But if those same Filipino people come to the United States, hold on, now you can't be civilized. Now you can't be assimilated. Even in the heart of the empire, or especially in the heart of the empire, or only in the heart of the empire, this entire logic breaks down. So you have this racial border making, internal border making in the form of immigration restriction against so-called undesirable, unassimilable elements, people who are not capable of self-government, people who cannot be citizens. And on the other hand, external border making through empire. And the extension of American sovereignty into foreign lands.
This was part of a long tradition, of course. It doesn't start at this time, right? But it changes as a result of Gilded Age industrialization. But I do want to draw your attention to one particular thing, which is that Latin America has always played an interesting role in the racial politics of the United States. Those of you who are familiar with Latin American history will know we tend to think of specifically Spanish America's revolutions as falling into the so-called Age of Revolutions, right? America, France, Haiti, and then Mexico, and then all these other Hispanophone states, right? Okay. The difference is that in much of Spanish America, abolitionism was tied politically to independence. And the result of that is the independence of Spanish countries in Spanish America becomes, in the imagination, tied to racial equality. Moreover, for a very, very long time, Anglo-Saxons in the United States, self-described Anglo-Saxons, had fancied themselves racially pure, specifically in contrast to people in the Spanish Americas who were seen as racially mixed, as, to use the language of the time, a mongrel race. And the result of this was a lot of people in the American establishment expressing things like John Adams did in 1815. The people of South America are the most ignorant, the most bigoted, the most superstitious of all the Roman Catholics in Christendom, and attempts to establish free government there are as absurd as similar plans would be to establish democracies among the birds, beasts, and fishes. He was not alone, and this racial language that suggested that people have people of an imperfect racial stock don't have the capacity for self-government. This becomes the brush with which Latin America is tarred by Americans, starting in the 19th century but stretching into the 20th. On the other side, the mixture of political independence with abolitionism inspired a lot of African Americans, including people like Frederick Douglass, who said, in the middle of the American Civil War, in Mexico, Central America, and South America, many distinct races live peaceably together in the enjoyment of equal rights. It's one of many similar utterances. So the idea of Latin America as a space of racial equality, either as a good thing or as a bad thing, ties into this longer history of racial border making. All right, you ready for it? You already know. Let's just play the game, all right? You obviously already know. I know you already know. You obviously already know it, but let's just try it. Okay? You ready? It's small. I'm going to read it to you. On the left. I admitted it's... whatever. Okay. I'm going to read it. There are racial Listen carefully. There are racial considerations too grave to be brushed aside for any sentimental reasons. Biological laws tell us that certain divergent people will not mix or blend. The Nordics propagate themselves successfully. Quality of mind and body suggests that observance of ethnic law is as great a necessity to a nation as immigration law. Observance of ethnic law is as great a necessity to a nation as immigration law. We must keep the race pure, and that means what? Keep out undesirable racial elements and no race mixing. This is from 1921. Ready for the 1927 one? I mean 8? I think it's 8. No, it's 8. I actually knew that already. I know. The American Union's power of assimilation has failed vis-a-vis the Chinese as well as vis-a-vis the Japanese element. Thereby, American immigration policy itself confirms that the earlier fusion presupposed peoples of definite equal race foundations and immediately miscarried as soon as it involved people who were fundamentally different. That the American Union feels itself, doesn't matter, to be a Nordic German state and in no way an international mishmash of folks or peoples, further emerges from the manner in which it allots immigration quotas to European nations. This is a reference to the 1924 immigration law. Scandinavians, that is, Swedes, Norwegians, further Danes, then Englishmen, and finally Germans are a lot of the greatest contingents. Romanians and Slavs, very little. Japanese and Chinese, they prefer to exclude altogether. On the left, a rationale for the 1924 law 3 years before its passage. Part of the debate around the Emergency Quota Act. On the right, an approving nod to that 1924 law. Who said it? Come on. John F. Kennedy in 1921. John F. Kennedy Sr. totally could have said something almost identical to this, I'm sure. No. Come on, who said it? Huh? No, come on. All right. Which one of these is Hitler? And which one of these is President Calvin Coolidge? Huh? What is it? Why?
Because referring to America.
And it has the word folks in it.
Ah, I should have edited it out. All right. You're right. Props. On the left is President Calvin Coolidge, future President Calvin Coolidge, in his very interesting article, "Whose Country Is This?" from the magazine Good Housekeeping.
What?
It's a good culture.
Good housekeeping is a propaganda magazine.
Well, then and now. There we go. Just so you all know, it's tough. It's bad. It's not good. All right, where did all this stuff go? If you have ever taken a civics class or whatever, you'll have learned, okay, yes, immigration law used to be racist, but then they fixed it. No. Well, okay, here's what happened. Immigration Act 1965, also called the Hart-Celler Act. If you have read the edited volume, Nation of Immigrants Reconsidered, you will know that, this is a sidebar. You will know that most of the innovations from this law were made in other laws in the 50s and then compiled into a whole thing in 65. Whatever, I'm not talking about that. I know, but leave that aside. Let's just say this was the law that did this. It swapped the national origins formula, which is dropped, that's the racist part, for various family and employment categories, 7 of them. Exemptions are made for spouses, minor children, and parents of adult U.S. citizens. So essentially, rather than saying you have these national quotas, now you're going to, by the way, national quotas that are unfairly weighted towards Western and Northern Europe, now you're going to have these new quotas. It's your son can come, but also we want certain kinds of jobs, right? And the way that the employment categories are made, it is essentially a class restriction. Right? Now we're going to be looking for professionals and people with high education, whatever else. So you're replacing a racial restriction with a class restriction. Not particularly free. This also maintains visas, or maintains a quota on visas. Sometimes this is mistakenly described as eliminating the quota system. No, it didn't. It did not eliminate the quota system. It changed the quota system. It creates this big old quota, 170,000 for the so-called Eastern Hemisphere, and says no single country can exceed 20,000. In other words, it doesn't even get rid of national quotas. It just changes the quota formula. It also is the first law. Pay attention, very important. Heads up. Get off your phone. I'm kidding. You're not. Old habits. It also is the first law ever to introduce quotas for the Western Hemisphere, 120,000, with no national limitation. They add a national limitation later, and we're not talking about it. But it's the first time this happened, which meant, for the very first time ever, in the history of the United States, there is a limited number of people who can come from the Western Hemisphere into the U.S. Can anyone guess what that's going to do? Is it going to generate a crisis of illegal immigration? Yes, it is. Yes, it is. Oh, wow. I could never have guessed. And so we get back to this, right? And here's what we're looking at. There's 1910, okay? And all the immigration before that, we're talking about Western Europe until about 1890, and then the rise of the Italians and Austro-Hungarians and Russians, and then World War I, followed by the Immigration Act of 1924, followed by the Great Depression, followed by World War II, right? And then this is the point where we amend the immigration law. And the lines cross, and all of a sudden, people from elsewhere in the world, who are not European, start to come in large numbers. Again, class limitations notwithstanding, and we should consider this because it's quite important. Push and pull factors don't change when you change immigration restrictions. By the way, you may be wondering, well, hold on. So when do you think? When do you think people started talking about, like, the border and illegal immigrants and all this stuff? When did all that stuff start? Well, I went back and I looked at presidential platforms from the post-war period, and wouldn't you believe? Here you have some numbers here. You can see this is from the U.S. Border Patrol. Quote, total illegal alien apprehensions by fiscal year. And you'll notice it's pretty steady. There's this jump after 65, big jump after 68, and then it just kind of goes up, right? When do you think the new quota restrictions for the 1965 law kicked in? 1968. See that jump? 96,137. That's when all the quota restrictions kicked in. Right? The Bracero program ends in 64, the Immigration Act 65, and then we have the start of these new Western Hemisphere quotas, and obviously we have a gigantic explosion, right? So when do people start talking about illegal immigration and the border and all this stuff? When does all that stuff start? Look a little further up. 1972 is the first time I could find reference to either of these things in presidential platforms. Republican Party platform, the immigration process must be just and orderly, and we will increase our efforts to halt the illegal entry of aliens into the United States. Democratic platform, this one's kind of interesting. We will reestablish a U.S.-Mexico border commission with Mexican-American representatives to develop a comprehensive program to desalinate and eradicate pollution of the Colorado River and other waterways flowing into Mexico, and conduct substantial programs to raise the economic level on both sides of the border. This should remove the economic reasons which contribute to illegal immigration. It would remain the policy of the Democratic Party until relatively recently to use this language of we're going to address the problem over there to stop the problem happening here. Which I suppose better than the alternative, but it's important to note. A, this is a discourse that's over 50 years old, and B, it's still predicated on accepting as natural the fact of quote-unquote illegal immigration. But if we understand the context in which this political issue was constructed, this looks a little bit different. Takeaway. If the border was ever open, it was before 1921. What we have seen since are severe attempts to limit immigration which, despite significant changes, remain the same in their basic character. A convoluted and violently enforced hierarchy of prioritization which produces impossible subjects and gradations of inclusion and exclusion. In other words, the basic logic of immigration policy has not changed since 1921. we go from here? This part's shorter. It's actually quite short. Well, let's take the last part of this performance to structure our thinking about the future. I have 3 prompts for you. 1, ask different questions. The questions we ask shape public policy common sense because they are weighted with assumptions. The questions that we ask shape public policy common sense because they're weighted with assumptions. If I ask you, how do we modernize third world economies? That question is weighted with assumptions. The policy prescription lives in the framing of the question. How do we secure our border gives us calls to close the border. Anyone asking how do we secure our border is not going to get a particularly compelling answer because this is one answer. It's one answer. It's stop immigration. It's build a medieval curtain wall that extends into the ocean like the 2010 movie Monster. Y'all seen that movie? I know. I think I got the right year on that. So we ask ourselves, what are better questions we can ask? Did I answer that on the slide? No! That's for you to do. That's the whole point. That's the yeah. Come on. I'm not giving you all the answers. That's not how this works. What are better questions we can ask? Think about it. And when you're assessing whether or not a question is a good question, think about the kind of policy prescriptions which are baked into it. Think about the assumptions baked into it. If those assumptions are unsound, you can just discard it. 2, think beyond what exists. Think beyond what exists. We should begin by dreaming up humane futures, rather than by trying to fully understand the intricacies of our deeply weird and complex immigration policies. You don't have to know all the laws to imagine a better alternative. And anyone who says otherwise doesn't want anything to be different. Because I don't understand all of it. Most immigration lawyers probably don't understand all of it. It's incredibly complicated. What you have is the broad strokes, and that's all you need. But even that, lay it to the side. Begin with dreaming up humane futures. What would it look like? What would human mobility look like in a world that wasn't bad? Think about it. What would human mobility look like in a world that wasn't bad? There's complexities to this. Okay, fine, face them. Oh, I want to build a strong welfare state. How does human mobility factor into this? There's resources that are extracted from the population by the state, and the population's shifting, but there's different... Okay, fine, whatever. That's not an unfair question to ask. It's an interesting question to interrogate. Fine, but start with the humane future. Start with imagining what human mobility looks like in a world that is not bad. Let that be the beginning place. Otherwise, we're doomed. Not to be all, we're doomed about it. It's true. We must begin. And by the way, this requires us to interrogate too what we mean by humane. It can be so difficult for people living in the world we do to even conceive of such a thing. But we need to rest ourselves so that we can generate the imaginations necessary to create that North Star of a humane future. And to tie these 2 pieces together, my third and final bit. Refuse inhumanity. Refuse inhumanity. No just or good world can be built if we begin by accepting defeat. No just or good world can be built if we begin by accepting defeat. Despite every pragmatic argument to the contrary, we must refuse all constraints on our political horizons which bake inhumanity into the pie. You can't start by asking, well, who's gonna be in the detention centers? Nobody. Nobody. Refuse inhumanity. Well, who's going to be ripped out of their workplace and have their children left behind with no mother because the paper was wrong? Nobody. Refuse inhumanity. Anybody who wants to begin their interrogation of the future by what we have and accept its constraints is not going to be capable of producing anything else. Because the structure in which we're living is autopoietic. It creates itself and recreates itself. You need to disrupt, which means you need to refuse. And so both in our imaginations and where possible in our action, it's important for us to refuse inhumanity. This should be our guiding light. This part I read. Of all the boogeymen and bugbears haunting American politics this election season, none is more fraudulent than open borders. To be sure, this is an effective propaganda term precisely because it conjures something commonsensical. Countries have borders, open borders means no borders means no country. But if you scratch the surface, there is nothing underneath. As a cascade of different geopolitical crises create greater and greater flows of refugees, and a combination of unequal development and climate change generate even more migration, all of our political leaders have opted to frame these human flows in terms of a border crisis. That is, of a border which is problematically open and thus needs to be closed. This is foolish. In truth, the United States has not had anything you could reasonably call open borders in a century. And the persistent use of that term today only sows nativist panic and leaves us unable to understand immigration policy as it actually exists, and thus to make meaningful changes to a system universally described as broken. Okay, right. That we have been and continue to be and will remain for the rest of time MCtheProfessor.GOV. Thank you very much for coming out to our 6-year anniversary, 4-year return show. There's about a quarter bottle left of Martinelli's. If anyone wants a sip! Thank you.